fight injustice with a sword. You might win the land, but lose your sister's respect.
The creative content specialist, I love Zoom. I have access to real-time insights, automated reminders, and see.
This series begins by showing a man named Brian Mills who is riding a train. At that time, Brian is not alone, but with his beloved younger sister, Callie. It is revealed that Brian is a former Special Forces soldier with above-average abilities, having received numerous awards during his time in service. Despite this, Brian chose to retire early at his sister's request, as she no longer wanted to see him constantly in the midst of war. Initially, everything seems fine, with Brian and Callie looking very happy because they are heading to the countryside for a vacation. However, things take a turn when some suspicious people enter their train car. Brian, sensing something is wrong, quickly asks Callie to move to the next car while he keeps an eye on the suspicious individuals. As Callie is about to switch cars, a shooting suddenly erupts. Although Brian manages to eliminate the suspicious people, sadly, Callie is shot and killed by the mysterious individual. At that moment, Brian can only cry his heart out as he sees Callie lifeless, and he becomes convinced that those people were acting under someone's orders. Upon returning home, Brian is swarmed by reporters asking about what happened. However, Brian chooses to remain silent and immediately embraces his mother. At that moment, Brian can only apologize to his mother for failing to protect his own sister. The scene shifts to the American Intelligence Office, showing the head of intelligence, Christina. At this point, Christina and her team are discussing Brian, who is one of the best former Special Forces soldiers. It turns out that Christina is very eager to recruit him to her team, but the timing isn't right because Brian is grieving. In the end, Christina instructs her subordinates to tap his phone so they can track wherever he goes. The next day, Brian and his family are seen mourning Callie's death. While everyone is busy praying, one of Christina's subordinates sneaks into Brian's room. The person quickly taps his phone and then leaves. Thanks to this device, Christina is able to track Brian's movements and even listen to everything he says. Unfortunately, Brian remains unaware of this as, after the morning ceremony, he is approached by Callie's best friend, Asha, who is deeply saddened by her passing, having considered her like a sister. In the end, Brian tries to stay strong by telling Asha that all they can do now is pray for the late Callie. In the late afternoon, Brian asked his father for permission to calm himself for a while at their second house. Initially, his father refused, fearing that Brian might hunt down those responsible for Callie's death. However, Brian reassured him that he had already taken care of all the perpetrators on the train, so he would not become violent again. In the end, his father allowed Brian to go. At the same time, all of this conversation was overheard by Christina and her subordinates because they had tapped Brian's phone. Because of this, Christina immediately ordered two of her subordinates to follow Brian wherever he went. Upon arriving at the second house, Brian could only sit in silence, reminiscing about the happy times he shared with Callie. As a result, Brian became very frustrated, as he had no idea where else to search for the mastermind behind her death. Later that night, Christina's two subordinates arrived at the parking lot of Brian's second house. They simply observed him from a distance, as per Christina's orders. Not long after, while Brian was drinking coffee, a car pulled up, and the people inside immediately infiltrated the house. Seeing this, Christina's two subordinates allowed them to enter, confident that Brian could handle it. Apparently, Brian had already noticed the intruders via CCTV and quickly prepared weapons to greet them. When the mysterious individuals were about to break down the door, Brian attacked first. During the fight, 3 people managed to escape, but luckily, Brian was able to capture one of them. Brian immediately interrogated the captive about who had sent them, but unfortunately, the person died from a gunshot wound before answering. With no other option, Brian took the phone from the person's jacket pocket and left. A few hours later, Brian checked into a motel to rest. At that moment, he treated his wounds as he had been hit during the attack. After that, Brian contacted an old friend, Casper, who was also a comrade before his retirement. Brian explained that he had just been attacked by a group of unknown people. Despite this, he was convinced that these individuals were connected to those who killed Callie. Therefore, Brian asked Casper for help in finding out who the mastermind was, and what these mysterious people wanted. Hearing this, Casper agreed and promised to gather
I forgot I was alive.
At dawn, Brian was awakened by a message notification on his phone. When he checked, it wasn't his phone that had received the message, but the phone he had taken from the attacker. Brian was shocked to discover that the message was from Casper. In the message, Casper asked the attacker whether he had successfully killed Brian, revealing that he was part of the group. Realizing this, Brian immediately prepared to confront him. As the sun began to rise, Casper was seen about to get into his car. Suddenly, Brian appeared, pointing a gun at him. At that moment, Brian couldn't believe that Casper would betray him like this. However, Casper swore that he had been forced into it because his daughter was being threatened. Brian then asked who had ordered Casper, to which he replied that it was Carlos Maggia, the biggest cartel boss in Colombia. It turned out that Carlos was someone who had been captured by Brian in the past, during which he also killed Carlos' son, causing Carlos to hold a deep grudge against him.
Sub up, y'all.
Brian quickly forced Casper to take him to Carlos' headquarters right away. Sometime later, Brian and Casper arrived at an underground station to head toward Carlos' headquarters. At that point, Casper mentioned that several of Carlos' men were following him, but Brian didn't care and continued on. Not long after, Brian suddenly stopped and asked if Casper had ever met Callie. Casper replied yes, and from what he knew, she was very beautiful and kind. Pointing his gun, Brian asked again why Casper had been so heartless as to take away the person he loved the most. Resigned to his fate, Casper said that if Brian wanted to kill him, he was ready, but after his death, he begged Brian to protect and raise his daughter. Hearing this, Brian couldn't bring himself to do it and told Casper to leave and never show his face again. Before leaving, Casper warned Brian to be careful, as Carlos's men were already close by. Brian then continued his journey and encountered Carlos's men at the underground station. Unfortunately, Brian ran out of bullets and eventually surrendered to them. As they were taking him to the car, Carlos's men threw his phone away, causing Christina to lose track of Brian. Luckily, two of Christina's agents who were assigned to follow Brian managed to capture Casper and interrogate him. Casper then revealed that Brian had likely been taken to Carlos's headquarters and told them its location. When Brian regained consciousness, he found himself held captive at Carlos.
Sub up, y'all. Sub up.
Shortly after, Carlos
What's the
appeared,
deal?
stating
Yo,
that a
what's
life
up?
must be paid with a life. Brian immediately
The deal,
explained
Z-Break.
that Carlos's son had died because he had pointed a weapon at a DA agent and questioned why he had killed Callie, who was innocent, calling it utterly unjust. In response, Carlos said that after Brian died, he would also slaughter his entire family, and only then would his vengeance be satisfied. Carlos then took a knife, preparing to kill Brian, but suddenly, the intelligence team and Christina's agents launched an attack to rescue Brian. After a lengthy battle, the intelligence team was able to take down all of Carlos's men. Unfortunately, Carlos managed to hold Brian at gunpoint, demanding that the team retreat. However, being no ordinary person, Brian launched a counterattack. The intelligence team even asked him not to kill Carlos because they needed him alive. However, Brian was determined to end it, forcing the team to knock him unconscious. The next day, Brian woke up in a hospital, followed by Christina, who arrived and introduced herself. Christina then explained that she was the head of intelligence and had long wanted Brian to join her team, but at that time, he was still in the military. Before answering her offer, Brian asked where Carlos was, as he still wanted to kill him. Christina then told him that Carlos was being held
Hit
in
that
an
subscribe
intelligence
button, y'all.
prison
Come on, we going
and
up.
wouldn't be able to escape.
2K likes. I mean,
Brian
2K
asked where
subscribers.
Carlos was,
Cause we
as
get
he
10
still
likes.
wanted to kill him. Christina then told him that Carlos was being held in an intelligence prison and wouldn't be able to escape. However, she advised Brian not to kill Carlos, as they still needed him for information about other cartels. Christina promised that
You'll be back! Evil can't help people customize and save Liberty Mutual!
Oh my god. Off of that.
that like button, y'all. Hit that subscribe button. Come on, man. Sub up. Sub up. What y'all niggas doing on there? What about that handsome? What about that handsome? Sub up, hit that subscribe button. Bro said he want to smoke with me like, we ain't even did nothing. Bro said he want to smoke with me like, he ain't even seen nothing. Ask him every day like, that don't even mean nothing.
In the military. Before answering her offer, Brian asked where Carlos was, as he still wanted to kill him. Christina then told him that Carlos was being held in an intelligence prison and wouldn't be able to escape. However, she advised Brian not to kill Carlos, as they still needed him for information about other cartels. Christina promised that if Brian joined her, he would have access to monitor Carlos anytime he wanted. She also offered full protection for his family and a large salary, much better than being unemployed.
Sub up, y'all. Sub up.
In the end, Brian accepted Christina's offer and officially joined the intelligence agency. A week later, Brian and the intelligence team were on a silent operation to infiltrate the terrorist
Hit
hideout.
that subscribe
The
button.
team successfully entered and neutralized everyone inside. While inside, Brian saw the terrorist leader holding a woman hostage. The woman looked so much like his sister Callie that it brought back memories of her death. As a result, Brian mercilessly killed the terrorist leader. At that
Hit
moment,
that subscribe button,
another
y'all. Come
intelligence
on.
team arrived and immediately reminded Brian that it was all
Sub up, sub up, sub up, sub up, sub up, sub up, sub up.